Today's video has a slightly different structure to last time. I usually recount what happened last week when we played, and through it I'll talk about lessons learned, decisions I made and such, and kind of reflect on as we go. However, the first half is just going to be a recap of what happened, and then the second half I'm going to analyse some key points in it. So, last week on Dragons and Dungeons, the party is now deep in the dungeon of Explicitica Defilis, the reptile god. They're down in the second level of the dungeon, having raced their way, in my approximation, through the first level. They skipped a lot of content on that first level and I had to do some rejigging. I was expecting a lot of the same this next week, but what actually happened was totally different. They never failed to surprise me. What happened was they got to the second level of the dungeon and they were presented with a few different routes. Nadar, the half-elven ranger, decided to scout ahead in a few places. He crept up through the corridors, twisting natural caverns of this level of the dungeon, and got a look at what seemed to be moving floor. The mud itself seemed to be shifting, changing shape, and scuttering about. Getting a little closer to have a look and have a listen, the sounds of scratching, clicking and chittering started to come to life. And as he got closer, he was able to inspect, after making a very high stealth check, what was a room filled with giant centipedes all crawling over each other through the mud, and it was pretty gnarly, and he retreated back and told the party what he'd seen. Looking around the other way, he sees a corridor going north-south. To the south there's some water, and to the north is a door. And these are kind of the three main routes my players kind of entertained throughout the session. And there was a lot of discussion amongst my players about which direction to go. A lot of them wanted to go towards the water because on the water's edge it turned round into this bigger cavern filled with water that they couldn't quite see around just yet, but it seemed fairly sizable, and it seemed to do a big U-turn back on themselves, heading north, which is kind of the direction they thought the rest of the dungeon was. However, one of my players really wanted to go fight the giant centipedes, but ultimately he was voted down, and the players decided to go scout down south to the watery passage. He spotted what looked like an unusual cutting in the stone wall just next to the water's edge, and it was here that the session really changed from what had happened the week previously. Because like I said, the week previously they fired through it, but this week the players must have spent 20 minutes just debating on how to do this next part. How do they go into the water? What order should they go in? They wanted to go around and have a better look. They didn't really know how to get through the water. They recalled that on the floor above them they had used a boat to get across the water, and they debated whether or not they should go and get that boat and bring it down here, and they asked me how long that would take. I told them how long, and I told them how many random encounters they'd have to roll for along the way. And honestly, like, most of this session was just the players discussing what to do in one room. Eventually, however, they decide that they want to check out what this stone shaping is, because they made an investigation check. They looked at the floor and saw some scratch marks, like scraping, and were able to determine that this was probably some kind of secret door, and that they should probably like check it out before they scout ahead. They got Arthur to help them heave the stone door open, and inside they found a boat. And looking at the marks on the floor, it was clear this boat was often scraped out and used to sail around this next part where the water is. And the party asked me how many people it could fit, and luckily the adventure actually describes exactly how much the boat can fit, which is 2 men or 1 man and a bunch of treasure. And that's going to be important because of what's going to happen next. The players go back and forth deciding who should go, and they make a decision. I believe they send Rufus the Bard and Flint the Cleric of Light. So they get in the boat and they start sailing round. Before they'd done this, they'd fired a couple of arrows into the water to see if anything was disturbed, because elsewhere in this dungeon they had used the same technique to great effect. In another cavern they'd done the same thing and had lured about 5 or 6 giant crocodiles through the water towards the source of the disturbance, kind of giving them safe passage through another room. They did that trick again in this room, but there was no disturbance in the water, which confused the players a little bit. They were starting to question what the purpose of this area was and what other things might lie in wait. So on the boat they start curving round to the left, following the natural cavern, and instantly they're ashore again, in a very small corridor. But what's important is what is here is a shelf with 2 chests. And at first point they're like, 2 chests just sitting here? I'm not sure about this. I describe how one of the chests is very ornate. It looks quite well crafted, of kind of nice varnished wood and polished steel. And the other one is still like nicely crafted, but not nearly as finely as the other one, and they both are locked. And again, the whole party spent a long time just debating on how to deal with this next part. Like, how do they move the chests? Should they move the chests? What might be in the chests? Is this a trap? And they spend so long talking about it that I just tell them, listen, if you want to bring the chest back over, like, you can just do that. You don't need to work out a plan for that. Like, it's easy enough, and the chance of failure is almost non-existent, so you don't have to make a check. You can just do that if you want. And it was just kind of needless confusion, so I told them they could just do it. And as this has all been going on, I got everybody to make stealth checks, which obviously my players groan at when I make them make a stealth check when they don't know what's up. But they all roll fairly low, and I described how through the door at the other end of this corridor, they hear a shifting and groaning like a zombie. Now that they had both chests together with the rest of the party, they spent a bit of time debating on which one to open first. The fact that I had described them as being different led to them having to think about why they were different. You know, what might be in the good-looking one and what might be in the kind of less good-looking one. And after some time, they decided to go with the less ornate-looking one, thinking that you know, a true wise man won't hide his riches in the nicest box. So Arthur Frost takes a crowbar, sticks it in, and push, pries it open. And inside they find a whole bunch of gems and like several hundred gold pieces. You know, no strings attached, that's what was in the box. And they were pretty happy with that haul. So right away, obviously, they decide to get to work on the ornate one. And just the same as last time, Arthur Frost gets his crowbar, sticks it in the chest, and I describe how as he's putting it in, he feels a click and hears a snap. He's triggered a trap of some kind. So everybody's instantly like, oh shit, we've triggered a trap. They decided to come up with quite an ingenious solution, however. Arthur Frost let go of the crowbar, nothing happened. And he used his frost breath, being a white dragonborn, to freeze the kind of whole front of the box and the locking mechanism, and then pulled the crowbar out, and nothing happened. And once they'd realised that they'd kind of frozen whatever trap mechanism it was, Arthur went right back to snapping it open. And I described how opening it up, you can see on the top and the inside where the lock was, like a small kind of trapping mechanism with a broken wire and a small vial of what looks like maybe acid, and a mechanism for spraying that acid out through the keyhole. With the vial of acid completely frozen over, the solution having worked, because you know, I thought it was a good plan and I thought it should work. Inside the chest, they found some more gems, some more gold pieces, and several hundred platinum pieces, which they hadn't even encountered to this point. So I described how, you know, it's 10 gold pieces to a platinum piece, and this is a hefty haul that they've found. However, most rural villages probably won't even take platinum, and maybe they want to look at getting it exchanged in some way. So with that, they decided to now make their way north to the other end of the corridor where the door was. And you know, at this point, we're maybe 2.5 hours into the session, and our sessions tend to last kind of 3.5 to 4 hours max. We spent almost the whole session in kind of one room, which is, you know, super unlike the group. You know, just like I said last week, they'd flown through the dungeons, so it was just fun to see this be the polar opposite for once. So they approached this door and listened in, and I described once again how they hear the groaning and the shuffling, how it's not immediately on the other side of the door, but it is fairly close. Listening to the echo, it doesn't sound like a massive room that they're in, but again, it does sound like one voice. So they think, you know, we can probably take one guy. So they kick the door in and it's initiative. And I describe how they see a zombie in a pretty bare room. There's a central column supporting the room and a few benches, a lot of blood and kind of guts kind of strewn about the floor, torch sconces on either side which would light the room, give it a faint light. Yeah, and just a single zombie shuffling around, which obviously instantly turns around to them and starts coming after them as they come in. Rufus the Bard wins the initiative order, and he pulls his short sword, his +1 short sword, which I don't think I've spoken about too much. This is its stats here. It's called Olander Monster's Folly. This is a +1 short sword imbued with the heroic spirit of a fallen knight. It's a gallant knight with no fear of monsters or the enemy, ready to charge into battle headfirst for glory, for honour, for death, for the kingdom. I have a lot of fun role-playing this sword because you can hear his voice whenever you grasp the sword, and my players find him, I'm not going to lie, quite annoying, but it's a lot of fun to roleplay. So right away, Rufus draws his sword and throws it at the zombie. And he scores, I think, like 7 points of damage. I think he, you know, rolls a 4 or a 5 and gets his +4 all in all, including the bonus. It impales the zombie through the solar plexus and it collapses to the floor, dead. So at which point the rest of the party walk in and start to inspect the room. And you really don't find much. You know, it's a very simple, very bare room. With the central column, the door on the other side, and those benches. So Rufus walks over to go get his sword back, at which point the zombie grabs him by the throat and starts choking him out, and we're back in initiative order. Because it turns out this wasn't a regular zombie, this is actually an older monster from the monstrous manual called a Coffer Corpse. And this is a really interesting zombie because It's a somewhat intelligent zombie, and that it plays dead. If you deal it like a certain amount of hit points, it'll go down like it's dead, and zombies don't do that. Zombies don't have the function to do that. But, you know, to the untrained eye, this just looks like a regular zombie. So Arthur Frost charges in and cuts off the zombie's arm, dealing it enough damage to kill it once and for all. They decide to head out of the room, and looking through the door, it leads to another straight corridor. Immediately to their left, there's another wooden door that's slightly ajar, and there's another wooden door at the end of this corridor, maybe 15-20 feet away. And I think at this point it was starting to get a bit later, and they just kind of wanted to try and pick up the pace a little bit. So they just decided, okay, let's just go left. Opening the door, they find a small kind of caged area, like a little prison. And just the way I started describing this, they saw the first cell, nothing in it. Cell 2. Nothing in this. And I went through that until they got to the 5th cell. They find chained up, beaten, starved, and scarred, a black dragonborn. Now, when they were in our lane, they'd heard stories of this dragonborn. Several months ago, this dragonborn paladin had come into town looking to cure whatever was going on in our lane, but he disappeared after heading out into the swamp and hadn't been heard from since, which meant that this paladin had been here for 3 or 4 months, and he looked in a very bad way. However, he was very pleased to see these rescuers. He implored them and asked them to cut free his binds, and he would tell them everything that he knew. And one of the reasons I think he was so trusting of them was that the party had another dragonborn in the land. Dragonborn aren't very common. In fact, this black dragonborn instantly thought that the white dragonborn, Arthur Frost, of the party was of the same order that he was, the Order of the White, which is a group of knights and paladins in service to the king. He asked them, how fares the rest of the Dragonheart? To which Arthur Frost had no idea what he was talking about. Didn't know. At which point the Black Dragonborn apologised for the confusion, realising that they were not of the same order, and introduced himself as the Paladin of the King, Sir Verthus Atharsiniax. Which is a fun name. I love just names like that. They're so cool. I remember I got him to roll on the table for what his name was back when they heard about him in our lane, because Arthur wanted to know if he recognised the Dragonborn's name, because in the world, Dragonborn are direct descendants of dragon broods. So this black Dragonborn was of Verthus Atharsiniax's line, and that is his name, Sir Verthus Atharsiniax. Try saying that like 10 times quickly. So they cut free his bonds, they help him out of the cell. Flint the cleric administers some very light healing, for which he is profusely grateful. This is a man of honour after all, but he says that his wounds go deeper than simple magic can heal. And you take one look at this guy and you understand that. He's in a very bad way. I even told the party just that, listen, he's going to be no good in a fight. If you give him a sword, he might not even be able to really lift it. He's limping. Really, he just wants to get to safety so that he can begin the healing process. But this was a really good opportunity for the party to kind of learn a bit more about the dungeon, about what was going on and threats that they might face. Sir Verthus Atharsiniax asked them if they were here to finish the job that he'd been sent on, and he told them about Explicita Defilis, because he had been brought before her and had been subjected to her magic. He said he was made to stare deep into her gaze and felt the charm overcome him, but was able to resist, which kind of hints at what kind of powers this enemy might have, and he recommended that you avoid its gaze at all costs, lest you fall under her magic yourself. He was able to tell them that he'd been taken to see Explicita Defilis a good few times, and they asked him, where did you go? He closed his eyes and said, out the cell, left. Then there was the scraping of stone, a passage, and then the reptile god herself. So now the party has figured out, okay, there seems to be a pretty direct route to Explicita Defilis, and I guess we best use that. And at this point we're almost 4 hours into the session, so the party's kind of looking to wrap things up, but they decide to go check out this last room before we finish. They open the door, and the scene they see is very strange, not really like what you see in a dungeon normally. There are a few small benches in this kind of long rectangular room, set up to be like pews, and at the end of the room is like a wooden dais, behind which is a tall carved engraved statue in the image of Explicita Defilis. They assume it's just a naga, but they can put 2 and 2 together. And in the room are several zombies all advancing towards them. The back of the room by the dais is like an evil priest of some kind, dressed in quite fine robe, ready to fight, and that's initiative. And this fight was fairly straightforward. The zombies kind of provided a meat shield for the priest, who was able to kind of cast magic and such. But the party has a lot of ranged characters. The kind of one real interesting thing that happened in this fight for me was that, if you remember, the half-elf ranger, Nadar, had 2 animal companions with him. Not because of his class, but because he had been casting animal friendship on them every morning. We had Kurt, the giant lizard, and Pop, the giant weasel. Kurt was everybody's favourite. Pop, people weren't super keen on for some reason. So I gave my player the stats for these creatures and told them, you control these in fight, they have initiative order, blah blah blah. And now this is a very kind of narrow room that they're in. It's easy to kind of funnel people into a line. And at one point, Nadar the Elven Ranger tries to fire an arrow at the kind of cultist priest at the back of the room. Now directly in that line was Pop the Weasel. I got him to make his attack roll, he rolled a natural 1. So I said, okay, roll another d20, and I didn't tell him what kind of roll it was, if it was a save, a check, or an attack. I just what to add. I just said roll a d20, and he was like, wait, what? Why do I have to do that? I was like, roll a d20. Just roll the d20, and I'll tell you what happens. He rolling quite high, and I was like, okay, roll damage. And he was like, wait, what am I rolling damage for? Why am I doing this? I said, roll damage. I think at this point the whole table had caught on to the fact that no longer was I getting him to attack the priest that he was aiming for. And the thing to remember about animal friendship is that if you attack and hit the creature that you have charmed with your magic, the spell ends. This was pretty heartbreaking for my player. I feel like the player who plays Nadar has had a really rough time of it. He's broken his hand, he's been poisoned several times, he's been trapped by giant spiders, and now this, the guy can't catch a break, honestly. So I describe as how the arrow hits the weasel Pop, it squeals and turns, looking vicious and angry at the whole party once again, and Stephen, my player, was just like, oh no. Next up was Rufus the Bard, and he made short work of the weasel, to great protest from some of the other members of the party. But I mean, like, this weasel was the enemy now, and Rufus thought best that he had to deal with any threats that he saw. You know, based on their position on the grid, this weasel being here meant that the enemies got advantage on their attacks, because now they were being flanked by an enemy. And in my system, if you're being flanked, enemies get advantage, and if you flank, you get advantage. So, with one fell swoop, the weasel was dead. I'll have you know that Olander, Monster's Folly, went deadly silent at this point. He understood, but he was not happy. The rest of the fight was pretty straightforward. They mopped up the zombies. The cleric had quite a few hit points and managed to get a good few spells off, but they made short work of him as well, and were left in this kind of bloody mess of a room with no door. Though Sir Virthus Athersyniax, having been blindfolded through this room, did describe the sound of scraping of stone. So they go to inspect the kind of stone statue at the end of the room and figure that there's some kind of secret door behind it, though they have yet to figure out exactly how to get through it. At this point, the players decide that they need a long rest. Some people have taken a good bit of damage, and they just want to get their hit points back, get their spell slots back, and kind of get back to full strength. They've also leveled up. Finally, they have hit level 3. This means the Monk Ankle gets his way. I think it's going to be Way of the Shadow. Arthur Frost gets to become, I believe, an Eldritch Knight. Rufus the Bard gets to pick his college. Flint the Cleric gets 2nd level spell slots. And Nadar the Half-Elven Ranger gets his Beast Companion. So everyone was very excited about this rest, being able to level up and such. And I asked them for their Order of the Watch because, you know, they're in a dangerous place. An easily defensible location staying in this room. But, you know, dangerous nonetheless. So they post their watch, and I get them to roll a dice to determine where the random encounter is going to happen. And then for whichever person it is on that watch, I get them to roll another dice to determine what kind of random encounter it might be. So I believe the roll was on the very first watch, which was Rufus the Bard's. I got them to roll on the random encounter table, which the players can't see. In the long corridor that he can see, because they've just been leaving doors open behind them, don't forget, he hears a chittering and a scraping of claws. Eventually he sees two kind of oblong points of light, like eyes, very strange eyes staring back at him in the distance. And looking at his sword, Olander, he notices it's giving off a faint red glow. He decides to grasp it and ask Olander what he thinks is happening. And Olander tells him that in the dark places of the world, foul things creep. Creatures drawn simply to the scent of death. Monsters, aberrations, horrible creatures of evil nature. This was a carrion crawler. A thick, bulbous, rotten, insect-like scavenger that feasts, hungers after the corpses of the dead, found only in the darkest places in the world. And this is the first time I'd been role-playing as Olander and hadn't just made him annoying. So the players, I think, really listened, and Olander was clearly disgusted by this, his voice becoming almost angry. But he's a professional. He recommends that they stay where they are and they wait. For the carrion crawler is a scavenger. It won't attack them outright. So the party waited it out, keeping an eye on it the whole time, and eventually the eyes retreated back into the darkness, the sword no longer glowing red. The rest of the watches passed quite uneventfully, spell slots restored, hit points regained. people began choosing the new spells, ready to take on whatever challenges might come next time. And at this point I decided to call the session. Now there's a few things that happened that session that I'd like to just kind of quickly reflect on and analyse a little bit. The first thing is when the players really ground to a halt at the kind of watery area, and we're kind of struck with either indecision or disagreements on what to do. It's my job to kind of pace the adventure. I kind of want to make sure that the players feel like they've achieved enough, without feeling like I'm handing them stuff on a silver platter, because I'm not. But I want them to, to have fun and make sure they get through enough things in a session. So they spent a long time just discussing what to do. And I decided to interject and be like, listen guys, if you go around and do this, it's not going to take you any time, it's not going to present any challenge, because that's not where the challenge in this encounter lay. The challenge lay in the trap on the chest. Some may call it metagaming, but I thought it entirely prudent as a DM for me to just step in and be like, listen guys, here's what's up. Which brings me to my next point, traps. I love traps, but I just don't use them that often because the way they're presented in the Dungeon Master's Guide just doesn't do it for me. I don't think that we're walking through a field and you fall into a pit and then you get out of the pit having taken 3 points of bludgeoning damage is really all that fun. I get why it exists, and I can understand the logic behind it, but it's just not really for me. The way I prefer to do it, which is the way I did it, was that I lay it out for them. I tell them that they've triggered the trap, and now the encounter begins. They have to figure out what it might be based on what I told them. The words I use to describe what's just happened, the breaking of wire, the clicking of something, tells them about the nature of the trap. And now they have to figure out some really creative solution of how to get out of it. It's not just, you trigger a trap, I roll a dice, you take 8 points of poison damage. It's boring. And the solution they came up with was creative, and I thought it could work, and it did. And I think it's like one of those little moments now that's going to stick with the players more than, one time you got acid sprayed in your face and you took some damage. Next up is the Coffer Corpse encounter. So this was an old monster, which doesn't exist in 5th edition. I did a little research online to see if anyone had converted it to 5th edition, but the conversions I'd seen just didn't really do it for me. I think the ones that I'd seen never really captured the essence of what this monster was about. Each monster in the monster manual has their kind of thing, A Mind Flayer has psychic abilities and can suck your brains out. A Shadow can creep up unannounced, and like a Wraith can use its life drain ability to kill you and reanimate you as a spectre. They each have kind of one thing that's at their core, what they're about. And like I said, the ones I saw online didn't really do it justice for me. For me, a Coffer Corpse is about a zombie that can take some hits, go down, and still be alive. It's about tricking the party. It's about being something a bit more than what it appears to be. So it became a pretty simple conversion. I really didn't do much work. I knew if it took like X amount of hit points, it would go down. I knew how many hit points it had, which had to be, a good amount more than that, so it could take the damage and still be in the fight. And if it grappled you, it would be by the throat, and you'd take kind of recurring damage round per round for this. And that's it. It's very simple. When you're converting these older monsters into new ones, and you're maybe getting bogged down in like, okay, this is hit dice, and it's got a THAC0 rather than HP or AC, you don't get bogged down in all that. Read the description of its abilities, and figure out how to take that essence and use it in 5th edition. Things like hit points and armor class you can adjust on the fly if you need to. And the last thing I want to talk about is the Black Dragonborn Serverthus Athersyniax. So this was a character that I had the NPCs mentioned previously when the guys were in town in Orlane, and this was maybe 3 sessions ago this happened, maybe 4, and he hadn't appeared until then. So this kind of left open to the idea that maybe he's dead, maybe he succeeded in this task, maybe he failed, maybe, a whole different things could have happened to him. But the reason I did that was because the players had kind of just fired through, and I really wanted them to be able to pick someone's brains a little bit about the bad guy. I wanted them to go into this dungeon, or go into, what final encounters might be up ahead, with a bit of knowledge, because it's not fun just going in completely blind and then getting broadsided with something you just couldn't see coming. But now that they've been able to kind of ask questions of Serverthus Athersyniax, who's had dealings with the enemy, they now are a bit more better equipped, so that when they're faced with challenges from the bad guys, they feel earned and they don't feel cheap. And those are my kind of main takeaways from this session, was that I think that pacing is super important as a DM. You want to make sure your players get through a good chunk of content, not too much, not too little. So you've got to kind of pull the strings here and there, sometimes from behind the screen, and sometimes just out in the open, telling the players what's up. I think that when you're converting older monsters that don't exist in 5th edition, you really want to just capture that simple essence of what's the feeling of the monster, what does it do, and then all the kind of bits and pieces and the mechanics around it can just kind of slot in. You don't have to think too much about that. And finally, I think it's important to give your players enough information to act on as best they see fit. You can throw in little surprises, But if the players walked into a room and just got hit with something that they could never have seen coming and it really screws them over, they look at me and be like, dude, what the fuck? Which isn't what I want. I want them to feel like they overcame something or that they felt defeat, that was earned. Both of those are fun and dramatic and they're quite engaging. So, I just want to make sure the players are equipped to deal with whatever comes up. And that's it for this week's video. I'm very excited for the players to see what's going to happen next week. I can't wait to just see how they're going to deal with the challenge. I have some fun things in store for them, which I think they're really going to love. I hope you enjoyed watching this video as much as I enjoyed making it. I'll see you next session.